has his right arm in a sling as he continues to try and fully recover from the injuries that he suffered during the Blood Feud miniseries at the hands of one John Sansker. And again, the continuity of that is all kinds of screwed up because it doesn't quite match up correctly with the publication dates. As we saw in the previous issue of Blood Feud number 3, where Twitch is actually suffering all of these injuries, that came out in August of 1995, and we already saw Twitch in the hospital trying to recover from those injuries way all the way back in, I think, June of 1995, so the whole publication dates are all messed up. But we're getting back into the main line here, and as I stated, this right here is not exactly a conducive representation of Twitch compared to his representation on the cover. Twitch is actually convinced that Sam is the one behind throwing this party for him. However, his fellow officers all state that this was all their idea, and they really are happy to have Twitch back up and on his feet, rejoining the force, and they've missed him in the time that he's been gone. Even Chief Banks comes out of his office and welcomes Twitch back to active duty. However, at this point, Sam and Chief Banks start to get into it. The two of them have absolutely no fondness for each other. And Chief Banks is not quite aware at this point that Sam has a file that was given to him by none other than Spawn himself that links him to Billy Kincaid and the children that he murdered. Sam, however, is investigating Banks on a deeper level to try and gain more hard evidence that he can directly link Banks to Kincaid with. And Banks is aware that Sam is definitely snooping around where he doesn't want him to be snooping around. And this has, of course, led to increased hostilities between the two of them. They were never exactly fond of one another before, but now Sam has become exceptionally brazen in the way that he addresses Chief Banks, mostly because he knows that he's got, some evidence in his back pocket and that Chief Banks was directly tied to those murders. At this point, Sam decides to, give up on the altercation and even tells Banks, some of us like to work around here, as he slams the door to his office. At this point, another officer named Eric comes up to Banks and tells him, hey, Sam's really been snooping around in a lot of files that all have to do with you, and I'm pretty sure that he's trying to uncover some kind of information to, do something to get you out of here. Banks thanks Eric for his words and information. Meanwhile, inside of the office, Sam and Twitch start to basically get the pleasantries out of the way and get back to work, as Sam apologizes to Twitch, stating, while you've been gone, I've been, really trying to buckle down and find anything I can to directly link Banks to Kincaid other than just the file, and I've come up empty-handed. However, Twitch is not upset about this and states, I really appreciate you continuing that investigation on your own. I know how hard that had to have been, being that, I've been laid up and you've been trying to deal with all of this by yourself. Meanwhile, in the alleyways, Spawn and Cagliostro are having a rather heated discussion. This basically boils down to the fact that Cagliostro has a lot of information that Spawn needs, but he won't just give Spawn direct answers to his questions, and always seems to be kind of manipulating Spawn and leading him to do things a certain way. And Spawn's kind of getting a little bit fed up with the games and wants to have direct answers to his questions. At a certain point, Spawn asks, what exactly are the forces of heaven and hell afraid of? And Cog tells him his potential. And it all boils down to the fact that Al Simmons, the current Spawn, is doing things that have never been done before in ways that have never been done before. Cog explains that each Spawn who came before him and was, cast back to Earth for their training has all done it in their own way. Some people tried to run from this training and not fall into the trappings of being a Hellspawn, while others just really embraced it too much to an extent where they just kind of went wild with being over the top evil and malicious. But what's happening now with Spawn is something that hasn't been seen before. And Spawn states, well, I'm not just going to do whatever I'm expected to do by the Mabalja or by the forces of heaven. But Cog explains to him, no, you are kind of already doing that. There's just one thing that's different about you than all the others. And he then explains that this all boils down to Spawn's costume. And this is where we find out that not only should Spawn's costume not have transformed yet, it shouldn't have done so for like another 7 years, which Spawn is actually quite surprised to hear. And Cog tells him that he's not exactly sure what's going on or why this is happening the way that it is, and that no one else is either, and that something very different is going on that everybody's trying to get answers to. Al asks, well, does that mean I'm some kind of super Spawn then? And Cagliostro tells him, I'm not really sure. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. But all of the answers that you're looking for lie within you, and you need to know that you've got to buckle down and start chasing these answers for yourself. At this point, Spawn starts to get fed up once again, not getting the answers to his questions from Cog. And he tells him, old man, you're just as crazy as I've always thought you are, and you don't know anything. And at this point, Cog just reaches out, touches Spawn in the middle of his face and says, oh, don't I? As we see Spawn's costume reel and just kind of rip up and rile up and go wild just from the very touch of Cog's finger. However, Cog's touch does more than just react with Spawn's costume. It also triggers a deep memory of his past as Al Simmons, as he remembers all of the events between him and Jason Wynn that eventually led to Wynn distrusting him to the point that he wanted to eliminate him, and Wynn then ordering Chapel to assassinate Al, sending him to hell, and basically getting him to the point where he was able to make his deal with the Mabalja. After seeing all these visions, Spawn eventually realizes that Wynn is the one who is basically responsible for setting him on this entire path. And so he realizes that in order to figure out exactly what's going on, he's going to have to confront Wynn directly. As he snaps out of it, Cog asks him if he's all right, and Spawn, as we can see, is somewhat groggy. His costume is actually very energized and basically raring to go despite him feeling wiped out. He says he's okay though, and Cog tells him, well, that's good because now you know exactly who your target is, what your mission is, and you should hop to it. Meanwhile, in Wynn's office, he is currently telling Fitzgerald that he wants him to remain vigilant and snuff out the mole that is definitely working underneath him. However, Fitzgerald has no idea that Wynn is actually working at the behest of Violator, and that he's been ordered by the Violator to basically start messing with Fitzgerald and all of his loved ones, including his family, as a means of trying to make things more difficult for Spawn. Fitzgerald, however, has no clue about any of this and is doing his best to try and track down any hard evidence that links Wynn to the misfortune that he was dealing with before, of having the police and the feds and the mob all converging on him. Of course, this is back when Wynn believed that Fitzgerald was in fact Spawn. However, he knows the truth now that Fitzgerald is absolutely not Spawn. However, he's still not entirely sure what it is that Violator hopes to gain through all of these things, but he's also well aware of the fact that he has no choice in what he's doing, and he has to follow the direct orders that he's been given by the Violator. Later on that day, Wynn has a very heated and not so forgiving conversation with Chief Banks, as Banks is very worried about someone closing in on him and is worried that Sam Burke may have evidence that links him to Kincaid. And he tries to figure out exactly where on earth he would have gotten any kind of file that could link him to any of the stuff with Kincaid. He wonders if this has anything to do with the file that Wynn received, but Wynn tells him that he's an absolute fool, as there's no way a mere detective would have been able to get his hands on the information or had the channels to tie any of this back to Wynn. And he also reminds Banks that it was none other than his caped vigilante, Spawn, that delivered the file to him personally. Then Banks starts to wonder, well, what does that have to do with Detective Burke? At this point, Wynn tells him what it has to do with Burke is that Burke is obviously some kind of distraction, and Spawn is the one that you should be focusing on, given that he's in your own backyard. Banks tells him, hey, you can count on me, but Wynn tells him, well, not so far I haven't been able to, as he hangs up the phone. This message is received loud and clear by Chief Banks at this point, as he knows that he cannot keep disappointing Wynn and falling short of Wynn's orders, or things are going to get real bad for him real quick. Meanwhile, Wanda Blake is on the phone with Granny Blake as they continue to catch up, and she tells her about how Terry's still super busy at his new job, but then informs her of a really large and generous donation that was made to the children's charity that she works for. And then Grandma Blake informs Wanda that she's also had some good news, as the pension fund from her late husband was under some doubt for a little while as he was retired from working for the government. But she's received news today that the payments are going to continue and that everything's going to be okay and she won't have to sell her house. However, what the two of them don't realize is that it was none other than Jason Wynn who was behind these seemingly very good things that happened to the both of them. Meanwhile, back at the police precinct, the quietness of Sam and Twitch's office is interrupted when another detective by the name of Bob bursts in to tell them that Chief Banks has taken a couple of his loyalists down to the alleyways to go looking for Spawn, and that he thought the two of them should know since Spawn was their case. Sam immediately thanks Bob for the info as he drops a cigarette and grabs his coat, as he realizes that he's got to prevent Banks from intercepting Spawn in any way, as Spawn told Sam specifically to keep Banks out of the alleyways and that he didn't want any police presence there. However, Sam kept the file that Spawn gave to him instead of giving it to Banks to basically let him know that, he was not to be trifled with. So now Banks has no idea that he's walking into what could be a very dangerous situation. Twitch jumps into action as well, going with Sam, telling him that I've got your back. However, Sam tells him that, I'm not going to wait up for you. And Twitch says, yeah, thanks for the encouraging words. Meanwhile, in the alleyways, we see that Chief Banks is questioning some of the homeless men, asking them if they've heard about Spawn. One of them says, I don't know nothing about no prawns, when Officer Lewis then grabs the man, holds a billy club to his throat and says, we just said Spawn and you heard us exactly the way we said it. Now stop fooling around and give us some answers. However, Chief Banks tells him to stop muscling up the vagrants, as he tells him, we're going to go and find this guy on our own and we don't need their help. However, Banks doesn't seem to notice the tall, shadowy figure behind the other men wearing a trench coat and a fedora. Officer Lewis then throws the man to the ground, and he then joins the other officer and Chief Banks as they walk away, starting to continue their search for Spawn. As they get out of the field of view, Spawn then casts off the trench coat and the fedora that he was using to hide his identity, and is rather enraged that Chief Banks is seemingly ignoring the very clear message that he thought that he sent to him. However, we know that Chief Banks never got this message because Sam decided to use the file that he was given as a way to investigate Chief Banks and leverage anything he found against his boss. So Spawn then takes off into the shadows to deal with this perceived threat and or direct violation of the rules that he set forth on his own. About an hour later, Chief Banks and the two officers have yet to find anything when Banks realizes that there's a very makeshift and ramshackle fence hiding what should otherwise be an open alleyway. He kicks his way through it, and he and the other two officers make their way deeper into the alleys when they finally stumble upon the place where Spawn's throne sits and are shocked to see such an odd thing in the alleyways. However, as they investigate this new finding, they are not paying attention to what's going on behind them, as the two officers are suddenly taken out by a shadowy figure. As Chief Banks continues to investigate the throne, he starts talking to who he believes are his fellow officers, stating, "My God, they think he's some kind of king. What are they, twisted?" But then Spawn states, "No, they're just thankful," as Chief Banks spins around, realizing that he's now alone, confronting Spawn on his own. He asks what happened to his officers, and Spawn says they're alive, that's all that matters. He then asks Banks what he's doing in the alleyways, and also asks if the file was not a big enough warning to keep him to his own devices. At this point, Chief Banks says, "I don't know what you're talking about. I thought you were working with Burke." However, at this point, the two of them are interrupted when Sam and Twitch yell at them to freeze, and Spawn asks, "Why didn't you give him the file?" Sam responds by stating, "I couldn't, it was too many interesting things, especially what I learned about him and Kincaid." This enrages Spawn, as he apparently didn't read any of the file that he gave to Burke, and he says Kincaid, and then slams Chief Banks into the wall and asks, "What did you have to do with that monster?" Sam yells at him to unhand the chief as he points the shotgun at Spawn with his finger on the trigger. And Spawn continues to put the screws to Chief Banks and says, "I want answers now." Sam again yells at him to stop, basically threatening to shoot Spawn point blank at this point. And finally, Chief Banks relinquishes and states, "It was Win," in a very hushed tone. However, Sam and Twitch did not hear that Chief Banks gave up Win, and they ask, "What did he just say?" At this point, Sam's had enough, and he says, "I'm going to have to drag both of your butts downtown." He then points the shotgun directly at Spawn's temple, and Spawn says, "We've been through this before. Your guns can't actually hurt me." Sam says, "Yeah, I know, but I'm guessing that if I blow your head clean off your shoulders, it's going to take you a little while to regenerate, and you're going to have a hard time running away if you don't have eyeballs." Spawn actually had never considered this before and is actually a little bit impressed and surprised that Sam would come up with such a quick idea on the fly. However, his costume reacts on its own as the cape winds itself around both Sam and Twitch's feet, and his chains then disarm them while they're tripped up by his cape. And before the two of them can even begin to react, Spawn disappears into the shadows. Meanwhile, back at the home of Terry Fitzgerald and Wanda Blake, they're having a discussion trying to figure out what their next move should be. Terry informs Wanda that he can't find anything that is directly linking Win to the events that took place earlier with him, which means one of two things. Either Win is telling the truth, which doesn't help them at all, because that means there's someone else completely different who was at the center of all of the things that were making his life a living hell. However, we of course know that it was in fact Win who was behind all of it. Or it is in fact Win, and the evidence is just buried so deeply that Terry can't seem to find it. And either way, this is going to pose some real problems for him. Wanda agrees that they're in a real bind at this point, but that Terry has to keep looking. She then does inform him, though, of the generous donation that was made to the Children's Foundation that she works for, and states that with all of the money that was given, they should actually be able to start the construction of the new children's ward at the local hospital. At this point, Terry reminds himself that he has been working really hard and that he has unfortunately been putting his family on the back burner. He continues to play with his daughter Cyan and tells Wanda that he's actually very proud of the things that she's been accomplishing, and that he doesn't tell her that enough, or how much he loves her and their daughter and how much the two of them mean to him. He continues to play with his frolicking daughter, who is squirming and kicking, and inadvertently kicks him in the nether regions, which makes him curl up in a ball. And Wanda just laughs to herself and says, "Now, Cyan, you've really messed up. Now you won't be able to have any brothers and sisters." To which Terry responds, "Very funny." Much later on that evening, back in the city proper, Jason Wynn lights up a cigar in his office and is suddenly confronted by none other than Spawn, who wastes no time in lunging for Wynn, grabbing him by the coat, knocking the cigar out of his hand. Wynn says, "What do you want?" And Spawn says, "I want you, and I want to, get all the answers for everything that happened, and I want you to pay. I've come here for payback, and I'm going to kill you, but I want answers before I do that." This, of course, has caught Wynn completely off guard, as he hasn't seen Spawn in quite some time, and probably figured that given the mission that he was sent on by the Violator, that he wasn't going to be seeing Spawn anytime soon, so this has got to be a rather shocking encounter for him. Spawn then tells Wynn, "Before I send you to hell, I want to know exactly why I was eliminated." Wynn has no idea what Spawn is talking about as he reaches for his phone, stating, "You're insane." However, Spawn lifts him up with one hand and slams him up against the wall, stating, "Wrong answer." And then he tells Wynn, "The pool of blood that you swim in is actually so deep that you have no memory of exactly who I am, which is what makes this even sicker, that your memory is so diluted by how many people you've killed that you don't seem to even remember any of them, and they all just blend together." Wynn then tries to act tough as he states, "You're not going to make it 5 feet out of this room before you're gunned down and killed." However, Spawn cuts him off by grabbing his arm and snapping it in half. He then tells Wynn that it's time he learned something. You can't kill what's already dead. However, at this point, the office doors to Wynn's office burst open, and a guard breaks in with a dozen, as Todd says, AK-50s are all pointed directly at Spawn. Now, those of you who may keep up with some gun tube and gun tubers may know that the AK-50 in 1995 was something that didn't exist and only just recently got built by one Brandon Herrera, which is pretty cool. Spawn turns around to confront this new threat. However, he is shocked by what he sees as he simply states no in a somewhat terrified look. Spawn is then very upset when he realizes that the contingency of security guards is being led by none other than Terry Fitzgerald, his former best friend in his life as Al Simmons, and a man he has saved multiple times as Spawn. He then states, "Not you too, Terry. Is everyone controlled by this devil?" And Terry states, "It's not that simple," as Jason Wynn simply smiles, realizing that he is accomplishing the goals that were set forth by the Violator, and that everything seems to be coming together quite perfectly as we reach the end of the story of this issue and see that Spawn's current power level is at 6,887. We then get to a page of image info, which I'm not going to get into because it's the same as all the other stuff from 30 years ago. Just basics about what was going on at Image Comics and upcoming releases that at this point have all been released. We then reach the spawning ground, the letter section in which readers can write in to have their letters answered or responded to by Todd McFarlane. There's only a few letters in this one, however, they're all really long. They bring up some interesting points, though. One reader writes in a letter who happens to live in North Dakota and says that there was a woman who was going around talking to the news and saying that Spawn number 30 was actually promoting racist ideas, despite the fact that the whole premise of that issue was that Spawn was fighting against the KKK and trying to help a black family in their quest to keep their land and not be driven off by these white supremacists. However, of course, she was either misinterpreting it or just trying to use this to advance her own agenda. And the story was actually picked up on in North Dakota by a Democrat senator by the name of Byron Dorgan. If you are a North Dakota resident and happen to recognize that name, please feel free to talk about it in the comments section below. I'd like to know more about this guy and what exactly he was trying to accomplish, especially given the fact that back in the mid-90s, the whole pro-censorship thing that he was trying to advance, he was actually trying to push for censorship laws with comic books and video games and television shows, especially ones that were quote unquote for children. That was typically something that was done by the Republican Party, especially at that point in time. And it is kind of odd to see that it was an agenda being pushed forth by a Democrat senator in the state of North Dakota. So I am a little bit curious about this guy. And if you have any more information about him, I'd like to know. There was also some letters that were, or one of the letters was actually rather critical of the Violator versus Bad Rock miniseries, bringing up that the art quality in that series was a bit subpar, which, if you watched my videos about that series, you can find them in the Spawn miniseries playlist if you haven't. You may realize and remember that I had many of those same criticisms. I felt that the artwork in that series was rather lacking and that there was a lot of shortcuts taken, but Todd defended it, and I understand he's trying to be a company man, and he's also trying to present Image Comics in the most positive light that he can, but at the same time, I feel like he was being a little bit too generous, as some of the criticisms of that book were very real and hard to defend in terms of how blatant some of the corner cutting was. And there's also then another letter that comes in where someone really talks about how happy they are with Greg Capullo being brought in and how much they think he adds to the book. I am also a person who was, and still is, a huge fan of Greg Capullo being brought in to work on Spawn. And it's at this point that Todd actually acknowledges the fact that all of the penciling is being 100% done by Greg Capullo at this point, and has been for some time, and that the only thing Todd is still doing on the book is inking. This is actually the first book, I think, even that the credits only list Todd as an inker and not a co-artist, which I think is actually pretty big of Todd to just go ahead and give Greg all of the credit for the artwork, given that he is the one doing all the penciling, which of course is the heavy lifting in terms of, getting the book's art done. But, again, I understand some of the people being critical of the fact that Todd's not doing it all on his own anymore, and this was supposed to be Todd's book. But at the same time, it seems completely unrealistic that Todd would be able to do all of this on his own without any outside help. So to me, the fact that Greg seemed to so seamlessly just integrate himself into the art and take over to a point where it's, basically indistinguishable from what Todd was doing earlier in a lot of ways, really speaks volumes to just how talented Greg is and how quickly his style has matured over time. If you go back and look at his first art duties on Spawn in Spawn number 16, you can see a huge difference in how more detailed and how much more quality he brings to the book from issue number 16 to where we're at here in issue number 35. We then get a couple of pinups. This one on the left by Mitch Bird, which, while not bad, is a little bit cartoony, which by itself wouldn't bother me. What does bother me is the fact that, honestly, this just doesn't seem like a Spawn pinup. Like, you could literally put any superhero in this exact same scenario and it would work. This is just kind of like a generic, here's a superhero scene, and Spawn just happens to be the one that's in it. And on the page on the right, we get a really cool image of the Violator by Tread Away. I don't know exactly who that is, but I really like this. I like the whole idea of the dead bodies being impaled on stakes behind him, and the chains and cape kind of wrapping around him a little bit, showing that he's basically about to do battle with Spawn, but Spawn's not on the page. The whole layout is actually really cool, and I appreciate this one a lot. I also like how huge the big back spike of the Violator is, and the way his proportions are done here. It's a very dynamic pose, and I like this one a lot. We then reach the end cap section, where some of the new McFarlane toys that are going to be released later that year are being displayed. And at this point, there's a very interesting part where Todd tells everyone that while there are color variations between some of the figures, that's actually just like a manufacturing type of, I don't want to say error because it's not really. It's just like they would essentially run out of a batch of paint for the figures and get a new batch in that wasn't necessarily the exact same color. And that's why some of these figures have different colors. They aren't Chase variants per se. And that wasn't anything that he was doing on purpose to try and make one version of a figure more rare than another or add to its collector value or anything. It's literally just that the paint supplier wasn't always getting them a consistent paint, which I found it, interesting that he would take the time to clarify that. And I don't know if this was becoming a thing that he was noticing where people are like, oh, there's all these different color variants and we got to chase them all down because this one's limited to so many figures and therefore it's worth a lot more money. And I think he was just trying to explain to people like, no, like it's just random. Like it's not like we're saying like, well, there's going to be, 100 where like the paint on this character's shirt is going to be a slightly different color of blue or something like that. So while I do appreciate him, trying to clarify that so that people aren't like killing themselves or paying way too much money for something that they shouldn't be, it's also kind of weird that he would try and like devalue his toys on the collector's market in that sense. But again, maybe it's just him trying to tell people like, no, just buy the toys you want, make sure that you get the figures you want. And if you notice there's a little bit of color difference, don't think about it that deeply. It's just like, who our paint supplier is. We then get an advertisement for the Spawn Blood Feud miniseries. If you'd like to know more about Blood Feud, you can check out my videos on the Blood Feud miniseries in the Spawn miniseries playlist. And if you're watching this in real time when I first released this video, I will point out that I'm going to be concluding the Blood Feud miniseries with issue number 4 next week, so stay tuned. And if you're watching this far in the future, I'm already done with the miniseries and you can go back and watch it whenever you like. On the next page, there's also a order mail away service where you can order trade papers and toys and comics, all from Todd McFarlane. Obviously, there's no reason to do any of this now because this is 30 years ago, and if you want to find all this stuff at this point, you're better off just going to eBay. And on the final page, we get an advertisement for Wildstorm's Chamber of Horrors, which is a book that I have never come across ever. I would like to come across it and buy it at some point to see what it was about, but this is actually the first I recall actually seeing any of this or an advertisement for this at any point. Of course, I've read through all these books before, so it's obviously just something I've forgotten about, but still, I'm kind of going to have to stay on the lookout for this book to see if I can get my hands on one. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for Bad Boy Con, which apparently took place in Phoenix, Arizona in 1995. I've never heard of this convention before. I don't know if it still exists, but if it does, cool. And if you've ever been to it, feel free to talk about it in the comment section below because I'd like to know more about this con and if it was any good. And that was Spawn number 35. Overall, I think this was a really good book. I like the whole idea of Jason Wynn starting to really put the screws to Terry and his family to get under Spawn's skin, and Spawn having no idea that Wynn is working directly for Violator at this point. I also like the fact that we can see that the police department is kind of split in half in their loyalties. Like, there are people who are friends with Sam and Twitch who are helping them, and there are others who are loyalists to Chief Banks and helping him. And I also like now that Spawn has finally been given a connection to Jason Wynn from Chief Banks. However, I still find it really weird that Todd's going off of the idea that Spawn handed over this file full of evidence to Sam and never read the part about him potentially being involved with Billy Kincaid and being the one who was orchestrating Billy's ability to go out and murder all those children. And that just seems kind of weird per se. Also, there's the problem too of the continuity where the Blood Feud miniseries wasn't being released on the right schedule. So, we've already seen Sam and Twitch dealing with the effects and fallout of that. Twitch specifically in terms of him being injured, going into the hospital, and now just getting released from the hospital, when we just saw in last month's issue of Blood Feud that he was just injured and everything was just wrong and released in the wrong order. And that's just a problem that Todd was dealing with at that point. I don't know why he was so bad at getting that stuff done and out on time. But again, like I said, I felt like the overall things that were happening in this issue, the story points, all of the way that the plot was progressing was really well done. And I kind of feel like that speaks more volumes to Todd handing so much of the artwork over to Greg and being able to devote more of his time to writing and really having a chance to go deeper into the plot points that he's trying to progress and address in this single issue. But then again, these are just my opinions. Your opinions may be completely different. You might think the plots were terrible and that none of this is intriguing at all, and you might not have a problem at all with the Blood Feud miniseries being released at the wrong time. But then again, these are valid points to make, and if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.